Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more Alternate History Hub. This time, the video he did around the start, shortly after Russia began their invasion of Ukraine. Did NATO really betray Russia? Before we dive in, make sure you go and check out the links in the description box below. I would love if you checked out the Discord and read the prologue and first 5 chapters. You can read those for free at the top of the Kickstarter thingy. My Bob. There are embedded links in the text. You should just be able to click it, boom, open up Google Docs, and you can print off the documents or just download them. And I think you can download them or print them off and read them or whatever. If you don't want to use Google Docs and you just want like physical paper in your hands, I don't know. I'm saying words to fill space. Did NATO really betray Russia? No, because NATO was formed specifically to counter Russia. That's literally the only reason NATO exists. Now, of course, NATO could have been a bit more helpful to Russia post 91 fall of Soviet Union, or was Soviet Union 93? Berlin Wall was 91. Did that happen in the same year? Or did they? I can't fucking remember, man. So, I mean, yeah, the NATO nations could have done more to be kinder towards Russia in the early 2000s and late 90s. I definitely think the West really dropped the ball in helping Russia transition from the communist state that it was into, well, not it never transitioned into a democracy, but I feel like there was an opportunity for it to happen, but I don't know. No, I don't know enough. But let's go ahead and dive in here and see what Alternate History Hub has to say on something that isn't actually alternate history.
Many might be wondering, how did it come to this? How, even after the USSR fell, did Russia go down such a different path than NATO? Was there ever perhaps some possibility that these two rivals after the end of the Cold War would have came together in peace? Because apparently Putin seems to think so, or at least he says so. His current track record with the truth isn't the best, by the way.
You really think someone would do that?
Putin says Russia
Yeah, no, what Putin says is just posturing or just bullshit.
wanted to join NATO, but NATO didn't let them. Is there truth to this?
What do you mean,
The answer to why Russia didn't join NATO is a story about a former superpower rebuilding itself from the ground up. How Russia, or at least the Duma and Putin, viewed their status in regards to the West. So first, the question we're all asking. When it comes to this whole situation, who's to blame for this? It's Putin.
Yep.
100%. This was all Putin. Even if NATO had done some bad things, even if Russia had some fair points about their expansion, even if NATO took over Ukraine, like Putin says, you still can't invade others. Like, it was bad when the US did it in Iraq. It's even worse when Putin does it now.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people do kind of tend to forget, and of course, it definitely did get brushed to the side just because the United States has been the global hegemon for the last nearly like 30 years. And really right now the United States is still the global hegemon. China is coming up and could potentially take away the dominance of the United States. However, they're not there yet. If the Chinese economy were to collapse, frankly, I don't think the whole world would be affected. I think there would be a sizable dip in the global economy for a time, but I don't think it would lead into an extended recession. The US collapses, there goes the largest consumer market in the world. China is not a consumer market yet. They're getting there. They're getting there, but they are not there yet. They're still, I'd say, fairly a decent bit a ways from being a consumer market. 'Cause the individual Chinese people don't really have that much cash, nor do they have the time Like they work like at least 6 days a week, I think. They get like and if you're working in like a factory, I think you work every day. Something like that, right? I don't know. I don't know what working conditions are. I don't know entirely how they work, but I know at least like they work 6 days. I know I've spoken to a couple people, a couple of native Chinese people, and like they won't say anything bad, but I'll like ask them like about their work, and they'll be like they work like in an office or something, and they're there like 6 days a week, something like that. Um, but anyways, what was I saying? I forgot what I was saying. Oh yeah, when the U.S. invaded Iraq, even though it has been kind of forgotten and brushed away, when it happened, it was very, um, it was not a good thing. People were not happy about it. Now, of course, that did get quickly, brushed aside because there really wasn't anyone to tell the USA no. You, at that time, 2003, you can't tell the USA no because there's no one like with the USSR gone. China is just around the early 2000s becoming a more economic dominant power, but that Chinese economic dominance doesn't really start to appear until really up until the last few years. China's become more economically dominant, but they still aren't above the USA. But like in 2003, there's no one really to tell the USA no. So, yeah.
1991, the fall of the USSR. Russia is weak and wants assurance from the US and NATO that they wouldn't spread east of Germany. Eastern Europe could be like a neutral ground, and the United States informally agreed. Or well, George H.W. Bush agreed. Verbally.
Bar. We can't show any
God fucking damn it. Of course it's Bush.
weakness in front of the Russians.
This was never an actual written agreement, it was just an understanding. Oh, also I was lying. This agreement wasn't made with Russia after the fall of the USSR, but before, with Gorbachev. The importance of this agreement really depends on who you ask. For avid Russian supporters, this was a legitimate, sometimes legal agreement that NATO promised and then broke. For NATO, their promise not to move east was an informal verbal agreement that doesn't matter. Throughout the last century, there have been multiple discussions between NATO and the Russians over their relationship with NATO. The first one, at least of note, was in 1990, where the United States agreed not to move east into East Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The USSR, though weakened, was still a prominent power, and NATO verbally agreed that they would never move in to Germany. And then the Soviets collapsed. Now, when talking about how important these promises were to the Soviets, we will never really know. Even Gorbachev flip-flops on how important these assurances actually were. What's more interesting is the constant mention of the CSCE. Never heard of it? It's because it never really panned out like it was truly planned. Whether or not any of this was true or just bluster, this talk of a united umbrella was seen as a viable possibility in the early 90s, before the USSR even fell. This is what Gorbachev and the Russians heard. Russia, at least if the Soviets fell, would be joining a united Europe. And then Clinton was elected. It's 1992, baby. The Soviets are dead. Bush, despite overseeing the fall of the Soviet Union and bombing Saddam's forces back into Iraq, still promised to not raise taxes.
Read my lip.
And then he raised taxes. So he was voted out. NATO was seen as a
But did that really... I don't know. I don't know how much that would have affected it, but of course that was before I was born, so I don't really know those things. But when we see like pre-2000s America in terms of how the politics are, now largely since Clinton, it's been 8 years Democrat president, 8 years Republican, 8 years Democrat. Trump being the outlier of the kind of precedent that was the pattern that was beginning to form. Right? He only served 4 years, and now we're with Biden for 4. Probably going to win re-election. I think the Republican Party is probably going to end up getting split. They're essentially killing themselves. They're choking themselves out. They're being fucking stupid. And of course, in an ideal scenario, that's what will happen. The Republican Party will dissolve, and then what we'll see is the Democrats split into two different parties: the moderate Democrats, and then the more leftist Democrats, like AOC, Bernie, those being on the left. Anyways, that's a different kind of political tangent. But around this time, I mean, they had just gone through. Let's see, we had 4 years of Carter after Ford took over from Nixon. Nixon had, so Republicans had 8 years then, and then Carter for 4, and then we had fucking Reagan for 8, and then Bush for 4. So 12 years of Republican rule is, I think, gonna matter more, is probably perhaps something that matters a bit more in people's minds, at least in how America tends to go with its politics over taxes and stuff. 12 years of a single party. And then, Clinton, of course, is at that time extremely fucking charismatic, very good public speaker. And also, as president, he was very effective. You could say probably, I would probably put him in the top 10, perhaps even top 5, because of how effective he was at really the American economy. But of course, he did also get lucky with the internet boom starting in the 90s. That definitely helped out. But
relic of an age that no longer existed. It was an active discussion in the 90s what the fate of NATO should even be. It was a stringently anti-communist alliance that no longer had a communism to fight, and yet NATO stayed. Now, let me take out this big ol' button.
This does not justify Russia's actions against their neighbors. It's so stupid that he has to clarify this. And I'm probably also going to have to fucking... there's probably going to be comments I'm going to have to delete. I swear to fuck, if any of you are fucking Russia supporters... Ugh. You're going to make me puke.
I should iterate that the Russians are not simply victims in this. For Central Europe, nations like Poland, Hungary, Romania, and even other nations like the Baltic states were living under Soviet control for decades. As soon as the Warsaw Pact fell, there was a real homegrown movement to join NATO, or at least get some protection from the West in case anything happened again. Would anything happen again? Who knows? The West didn't know, the Russians didn't know, and this was kind of the basis of Clinton sort of keeping NATO around. We're into 1993. Russia is slowly rebuilding, with a few hiccups along the way. Clinton comes to Boris Yeltsin with a proposal, a partnership for peace. All of Europe now coming together. Nobody would need to expand NATO if we all were just in this partnership together. And then Clinton drops the bombshell on Yeltsin. This whole partnership for peace was not an alternative to the expansion of NATO. It was a preparation for it. To which Yeltsin replied, why? NATO was created in Cold War times. Today it's trying to find its place in Europe, not without difficulty. It's important that this search not create new divisions, but promote European unity. We believe that the plans of expanding NATO are contrary to this logic. Why sow the seeds of distrust? After all, we're no longer adversaries. We are partners. Yet the plans continued. Poland, Hungary, and Czechia soon joined NATO. Yet this wasn't the breaking point in relations. Russia still remained a part of the NATO cooperation sphere. There was an optimistic view that the kinks in this whole thing were slowly being worked out. Now, keep in mind, this whole time, NATO is entirely justified in what they're doing. They're technically not doing anything wrong. But from the Russian mindset, going from a communist superpower to a mafia state, where this man is their leader, well, they felt nothing but shame. That fear and paranoia only began to grow, and it became manifested when this guy came to power. But even with Putin in office, and him winning the presidency through some zany means, Russia was still somewhat friendly with the US, yet that was going to change. In 2004, NATO, under Bush's push, brought in 7 new nations. Now, once again, if these nations wanted to join NATO, that's fine. But after a decade of this, Russia became paranoid that NATO was simply out to get them. And then Bush welcomes in these nations as escaping an evil empire.
The door to NATO will remain open until the whole of Europe is united in freedom and in peace.
You can even go back to articles in 2004 where people say Russia is going to change their foreign policy. The Russian Duma began freaking out, and the first man they ran to was a violent Putin. Georgia was invaded 4 years later.
You see, like, you do things like that, and your response to what you're calling NATO aggression, Western aggression, is to then invade a foreign nation that is not a part of NATO. You're not helping yourself out there.
Keep in mind when I say Russians, I don't mean all Russians. I mean the Russian government, which should usually be clear, but I just know some of you are gonna...
For people also here, what he's saying, listen, because I know how YouTube comments can be on these reactions sometimes.
try to use that as a gotcha. One question may be on your mind. After the Cold War, why didn't the Russians just join NATO if they were so afraid of it? General opposition to the West, for one. Russia, even while the USSR was collapsing, didn't want to view this as a defeat. They wanted to view this as a new age. Then it turns out only their institutions fell. But there's also another reason why Russia didn't join. NATO is not simply an alliance, it's a structured machine. When a nation joins NATO, it is not simply changing to the blue team. The way its military is organized becomes based around being able to work within that machine. A country joining NATO is a process that takes years. This isn't a process that simply happens. For one, a nation joining NATO has to be unanimously accepted by everyone. And it also has to be voted on by that nation's population. As an example, Hungary in 1997 voted 85% in favor of joining. Would the Russian people ever have accepted to join an organization that they believed was an arm of the American empire?
Yeah, he makes a good point with that one. I do think maybe mid 90s Russians might have. I do think that one would have been a possibility. But then again, of course, it really depends on, like, I don't know the general attitude of Russians in that time period. But as someone who tries to generally hold an optimistic outlook on on history and people, although it is very hard at times, I do like to think that Russians, they just got screwed over by people who held power and were very good at warping the truth, or just outright very good at lying, like Putin. He's he's good at it, and he's now so established that you can't remove him, right? He's grown so powerful that he cannot be brought down except by his own actions, is what it feels like at times. Because the USA is never going to, take him out unless he gets super fucking, like, batshit crazy. I don't think it would ever happen. But Yeah, I think mid 90s Russians may have. I think there would have been a chance. I think it would have been close. I don't think it would have been over 60%. I think we'd see something around like a 51-49 split, that kind of like a really tight kind of vote.
What if you could do SEO smarter and faster? With Wix, you can edit your meta.
The rule of geopolitics is the closer you are to a superpower, the more they mingle and try to control your nation. And that's what
Wait a
Russia
minute.
really power. The more they mingle and try
Are you doing a not being China?
to control your nation. And that's what Russia really views a lot of their neighbors as. Just pawns on a board for which they, as the stronger nation, have the right to control. Their goals in Europe simply drive others away from them. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. NATO expansion closer to Russia only made them more paranoid and isolated. However, if NATO didn't expand, who's to say what countries like Estonia might find themselves in right now? It's clear Putin has some fantasy about rebuilding the Russian Empire, or at least the influence of the USSR. This video is not about two equally bad camps. NATO's greatest sin, at least in this regard, is leaving its doors wide open. It's
Yeah.
been said that Americans should imagine what it'd be like if Canada fell to Chinese influence. Complaining that your geopolitical rival lied about letting your former allies into their compass club doesn't make you look like a victim. Nobody would feel sorry for the United States if China took Canada. They would laugh. Oh wait, actually we don't need a hypothetical. The same situation happened with the US too, with Cuba. And we know how the US would react when a neighbor turns to the enemy's side. Keep them sanctioned for decades, which, here's a little tip, is a bad thing to do too. Whataboutism is used a lot by pro-Putin supporters, bringing up every transgression the US has ever done. And it's true the United States has done a lot of bad things. Iraq, for instance, that was bad. It's funny it's being used as an equivalent because people in the West at the time protested the war.
Thank you, alternate history. Yes. Oh my god. Like, let me tell you, I don't like this fucking country either. But goddamn, Europeans, you piss me off.
Without disappearing. The closest the US had to censoring opposition to the Iraq War was when the country industry killed off the Dixie Chick's career. Can Russians today say the same thing? Or are they not even allowed to call this a war but a military operation? That said, we should be asking some questions to ourselves. Did NATO still need to exist after the Soviets fell? Did NATO existing push Russia towards a nationalistic paranoia in its reforming years that undermined the same liberal democracy that the West was trying to plant within the country?
I definitely think that the continued existence of NATO made it easier for people like Putin to become in control. I don't think it's. But, right, but the problem though is NATO falls, right, and you're not trying to too actively. Now, of course, I don't know how active or inactive the U.S. or the West in general was in Russia's transition from communism to its, well, oligarchic state that it is now. I don't know how much they interfered. So take what I say with a grain of salt. It really depends. But like NATO needing to continue to exist, you can't blame that because no one, as he said earlier on in this video, there's nothing really at that time, and also with how people, I mean, one, within that century, we see how, you know, Germany went from one position of government into a different form of government. We see even after, 10 plus years, the Weimar Republic still fell to an extremely aggressive fascist state. And of course, if you look at kind of the circumstances of things, it is entirely possible for Russia to have fallen down that same path. And you could make arguments that they are, though Russia hasn't actively tried any genocides yet that I'm aware of, at least to the same scale. China's the one doing the genocide right now against the Uyghur Muslims. I don't know if Russia's doing anything. I haven't heard. Although some could argue that maybe a genocide against the Ukrainians is what's happening right now, which there's an argument. I think there could be an argument for that to be made if Russia was being successful. So still an attempt, perhaps. But I'm getting sidetracked. Right, it's hard to predict a country when it's changing its government in a uprising, right? That is what Russia did against the communists. Essentially, it was technically an uprising. It wasn't as violent as it could have been, like it was when the Reds versus Whites. It wasn't like that Russian Civil War, nowhere close. But it was still a big upheaval, and how that plays out is exceptionally hard to predict. No one ever really gets it right. So keeping NATO around as a caution, understandable. However, it existing makes it easier then for people like Putin to take power, to use the situation and manipulate things. Which then, of course, you can look at, is this a situation where perhaps the West should have gotten more involved? Which then, two things happen. Either that drives a further wedge between them, or we see something like with the Marshall Plan at the end of World War II, where the U.S. just dumps in a bunch of money, and suddenly we're friends, right? The U.S. helps them recover, things like that, which I don't think happened in the 90s for Russia transitioning. If the West had, gone in and helped, but of course that then depends on the only way that the West getting involved in Russia's transition would be if Russians invited the West in to help them establish a government, which then goes back to the question of, would Russia join NATO? And like I believe, 90s Russia would have voted, it would have been a close vote on either side. I think Russians in general, from their culture, historical culture, their temperament, who they are as a people, they're not going to ask for help. So really, kind of just a lose-lose situation here, right? Dismantling NATO leaves up a lot of uncertainties for Eastern European countries that are neighboring Russia, depending on if Russia goes down a dark path with its transition. Leaving NATO makes it, keeping NATO around makes it easier for bad Russian actors to take advantage of the situation and warp it and use it as propaganda to get young Russians to think that the West is completely bad and are targeting them, which not the case. Russians are white. Sadly, it's like the truth. That does affect things, how Western countries interact with other countries is the color of one's skin. That is just a fucking fact. So yeah, it's a shitty situation with essentially no good outcome.
Was NATO obligated to give Russian interests the time of day? Do geopolitics even work like that? For my personal opinion, I believe that the Russians had far different expectations for what a post-Soviet world would look like. The Russians believed, in part because of those 1990 talks involving East Germany, that with the end of the Warsaw Pact, NATO wouldn't expand. that instead there would be some coalition in Europe where Russia has special privileges. While to the Americans, they took the fall of the USSR as a victory. Their promises to the Soviets were when the Warsaw Pact still existed. With the collapse, the Americans now oversaw a Central and Eastern Europe that was eager to join in the economic
blue jeans and
prosperity of the
McDonald's?
West. It was a complicated act balancing these nations while also trying to not exclude the Russians. A Europe that Russia claimed it wanted to be in. Yet Russia only became more and more isolated. While much of this discussion is around NATO, this is simply one element. NATO, up until recent events, didn't actually move their military equipment past those original 1991 borders. The main issue the Russian government has isn't just a military bloc, but Western institutions. Or at least institutions that don't serve their interests. If Putin wasn't blaming NATO, the problem would be something else. Like, I don't know, the whole thing that started this in the first place. Like Ukrainians wanting to join the European Union. Putin's Russia really has been their own worst enemy for a while, as every hostile action, every threat, every influence, every corrupt politician has only made their former allies turn against them. It's always good to try to see from all perspectives, yet not all perspectives are equal. Sometimes the perspective is simply that another nation was a mistake to exist. Sometimes it's that the collapse of the USSR was the most catastrophic event of the 20th century. Even if there was a kernel of truth to the idea that NATO misled the Russians, it does not justify their actions. Should Putin really be talking about how misleading is bad? Kind of seems like that was their strategy for the last few months. NATO is not a perfect organization. However, if the nations of Europe want to join this club, it should always be their right. Russia expected the continent to remain a neutral ground for their own interests, even after their pact collapsed. And when that didn't happen, they claimed...
No, here's the thing. They didn't want it to be neutral ground. They wanted it to be their ground. In geopolitics, there is no such thing as neutrality. At least in the modern day, there is no such thing as neutrality. And of course, you can argue Switzerland and Sweden kind of have managed to keep that balance, only because they just never... But like, you know, Belgium in 1914 was a neutral nation. It didn't have a choice. It was invaded. Right? In this day and age, I don't think, at least with how the 20th century went and what was shown, with how powerful, aggressive nations treat neutral nations, there really isn't neutrality. Either you are with them or you're against them. And that's essentially how the big nations act. Right? Like China does it too. Russia does it. USA does it, though not as, I won't say as openly as Russia has made it very apparent as to either you are with us or you are against us. No, that sort of shit. Yeah.
No fair. You do not start wars over verbal agreements that happened before most of your troops were even born. We cannot forget that this all is coming down to a real war within a split nation. A war that, while true has been raging for 8 years, only began because the Russian side didn't have their guy in charge anymore. One that escalated into an invasion of an independent nation, which regardless of the justification, only justifies the fears of Russia's enemies. So, yeah, congrats Putin. You were the monster that proved NATO was right to build up. While this alliance didn't know what it was going to be in the mid-90s, it sure does know now. You didn't want to be a part of Europe, and now you get your wish.
And that was, did NATO really betray Russia? This was an excellent video. The last video we watched like a week or so ago from Alternate History Hub was one of his older ones. This is one of the newer ones made, obviously, within the last year. And it was really well done, well scripted. I'm very, impressed. but he was very good with how he worded things, explaining things, explaining his thought process. Got no real complaints with this video, and nor do I don't think I have any disagreements with him in it that I can think of. I think we generally align on our thoughts here in this situation. And really shouldn't be, most all normal thinking people should be thinking the same thing. Russia is bad in this situation. With this, they're in the wrong. Putin bad. Putin shit. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.